Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China and Mexico will celebrate the 50th anniversary of establishing diplomatic relations in 2022. How can we assess 5 decades of bilateral ties between the two countries? How is Mexico facing the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic? And what is the future of China-Mexico cooperation in a changing world of unilateralism and a backlash against globalization? With all these questions in mind and his thoughts on democracy in the 21st century, I'm honored to be joined by a very special guest, the former president of Mexico from 1994 to 2000, and currently the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization, Mr. Ernesto Zedillo. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you, Dr. Zedillo, for joining us. I remember you said that global powers that stay on a path which dismisses a rule-based international system will lead to a repetition of human suffering or even worse, such as the 2 world wars and the American Great Depression. So what signs are you seeing now in the world that makes you a comment like this?
Well, first and foremost, I think the preparation and the reaction, the response to the pandemic makes me feel pessimistic and some days even angry because I think this crisis, this public health crisis, has been so bad. Basically because, number one, countries did not get ready for an event like this according to the rules that they have subscribed to in the international health regulations and in the covenants of organizations such as the World Health Organization. So that's one fact. Second fact is that once the pandemic hit us, I would have expected an unprecedented effort of international cooperation and coordination to control the pandemic and to respond to it. And unfortunately, that has not been the case. So I think this is evidence that governments are not really honoring this idea that if you want to live with all the advantages in an interdependent, highly connected world, then they better cooperate for their own individual national interests. I'm also worried because one system that has also served very well the interests of countries, which is the international trading system, has been really mistreated by many of its stakeholders very poorly over the last 20 years, beginning with the failure to conclude successfully the Doha round, and more recently, and very concerning, the trade wars that we have seen over the last few years, particularly those initiated by the United States. So the trading system is being undermined, which means that the rules-based trading system is being weakened, and therefore we cannot be optimistic at all about the future prospects of international trade and the health of the global economy. So those 2 facts alone made me very concerned, but I could continue with my list of other global threats that are not being managed properly by governments, the key governments in these endeavors. Not to speak also about, for example, the nuclear threat. We have sort of abandoned the idea that the effort to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, that idea has been abandoned. And now what we are seeing is some countries under the mantra of modernizing their nuclear weapons are investing in developing new nuclear capabilities. And I think this is also an issue that calls for a strong international cooperation.
Mm-hmm. We'll go into details about your concerns, and I think they are the facts, unfortunately, over the years in the international community. Well, China and Mexico, have both been vilified as job killers, and you have made the statement that, when a country's economy goes wrong, there's often a backlash against globalization, and politicians are duly looking for foreign enemies to attack. You have also pointed out that it is often the political system of a country, not the trade system, that is failing to provide the people of a country a fair opportunity to participate in the modern economy. Can you expand on that?
Yes, we have known all along that when there is international trade, and that is for good reasons, that is to take advantage of comparative advantage and specialization, there are going to be consequences in the prices of the merchandises that are traded. Usually those prices come down and quality goes up. And that in turn has consequences on other economic phenomena, like the allocation of resources and also the compensation or remuneration to factors of production like labor and capital. We know all along that this is going to happen. Given this fact, it is usually very easy for politicians, rather than admitting that they have failed to anticipate redistribution consequences of trade and adopt the right public policies, they find easy to start blaming the others, the foreigners, for their failure to do their own job. So that's one problem with that kind of statements. The other problem is that they tend to ignore that there are many other factors at play associated with these events that they don't like happening in the economy. First and foremost is technology. I think it is great that science and technology has evolved very rapidly over the last 2 centuries, and particularly so in many areas in the last half a century. And that has allowed new means of production, but also new services, new manufacturers that we could not think of a few years ago. And all of that, of course, also has consequences on how you use your national resources. And sometimes that leads to negative consequences for employment in certain industries, in certain sectors, in certain localities. So these people take these examples and then generalize it to, number one, blame it on trade, not on technology, because nobody wants to say that the technological progress is bad by itself. Nobody wants to say that, because it is not, but they don't want to say it also to say, oh, the blame is of technology, because then you have a very abstract adversary. So it is very easy to blame the Mexicans or the Chinese for whatever effects that are in production. And the problem with that argument is that it's an incomplete and wrong argument, and also that it leads to very negative conclusions. Also because it's not paying attention to the other benefits that international trade and international investment is bringing for their own populations. So it is very common to say in the United States, oh, look, in this town in Massachusetts, there were so many factories and they were destroyed by international competition, right? Instead of saying, number one, that nothing was prevented to build social safety nets for those populations to prepare them to compete in the new world. So that's a failure of domestic policy. That's not a failure of the international trading system. So I think we have to be very keen in observing all the effects. They should say, well, because of this international competition, now the US consumers have more goods at cheaper prices available, and that is good. But they ignore that part. They say, well, now American companies are able to compete better in the world by being able to access international markets, not only as markets, but also to get the resources to produce better and more competitively. So I think we have to take into account the whole picture to make a judgment. But very frequently, these statements, like the ones you referred to, are only partial and very often very wrong statements.
Globalization is in trouble. Regional free trade doesn't stop. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, comes into effect in January. How will China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 ASEAN countries benefit from that?
Well, you know, anything that allows more open markets and the rules and mechanisms to enforce that rules is in principle convenient and better for the countries participating. Of course, if the rules are good. Now, you push me in the argument. What I would like to see now is all political capital apply to reinvigorate the multilateral trading system. I think we need a multilateral, a truly multilateral system. What has happened is that by opting for second best options like regional trade agreements, the attention to the multilateral system has been diminished. And now we are seeing the consequences because that system is significantly weakened. What I would like to see in the next round is to see the US, China, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Latin American countries reinvigorated to work for a truly open, non-discriminatory trading system that acquires again a mechanism of enforcement of the rules, because that mechanism of enforcement of the rules is now not in operation. You know, the WTO has lost temporarily, I hope, is dispute settlement understanding in the part of the tribunal that decides those disputes. And I think that's very unfortunate. So as a first step, countries should agree on how to put back in place the full implementation of the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. But of course, the agenda is very, very long in issues that are not yet looked after.
Let's have a break. We'll continue our discussion after we get back. Welcome back. Well, if you focus on China a little bit more, you know, China has submitted its application to join this CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So from the view of Mexico, you know, which is a member of this organization, what do you make of China's application to join this CPTPP?
Well, you know, I cannot speak on behalf of Mexico because I am no longer a representative of Mexico. I had stopped being one many years ago 21 years ago, I can speak as an academic. And I would say that China's initiative should be taken very seriously. Of course, these things happen only through a process of negotiation, but I think it will be excellent if country members and China found ways to have China a member of this association.
Well, the topic of democracy, has been brought up a lot, especially by the United States, on many global and diplomatic matters. Most recently, the Summit for Democracy, hosted by Joe Biden in the U.S. As a former president who labored for the promotion of democracy in a country which is a very important neighbor of the U.S., how do you comment on this unusual rise of discussions on democracy over the past few years?
Well, this is not new. From time to time, there are these initiatives the intention is to promote democracy. And I think that's a good intention, but one has to wonder how it is done. I think it is very hard to, and probably not always good, to promote democracy from outside. Mm-hmm. I think democracy must be a national aspiration. You must build a national consensus. You must have national leadership to promote that democracy. Because when political ideas are promoted from abroad, usually you get a negative effect. So I'm not terribly supportive of this kind of initiatives. I think what we must promote are the universal values that are in the UN Charter and also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that's what we should be strong advocates, because on the other hand, I don't think any country has really, let's say, the total clean moral authority to promote democracy. I think you have to promote respect to human rights, respect to freedoms, respect to freedom of speech, respect to freedom of beliefs, but you don't have to tell countries, be democratic according to my own standards. I think that is not terribly useful.
Well, China is different from many Western countries in how leaders are selected. Over the past 72 years, China's political system has evolved to its current stage, which many people would say best meets the needs of the country. But this system is still often questioned or said to lack democracy by the West. So how do you evaluate China's way of governance?
Well, I'm nobody to evaluate or opine on China's system of governance. I think it's up to the Chinese people. And it is the responsibility of the Chinese leaders to listen to the Chinese people, because that's the most important opinion. I think China must be admired for its economic success. I think it's a success unique in human history. The speed with which China has acquired this incredible economic progress. Of course, there are still many things that the Chinese government and the Chinese people want to achieve, additional successes, higher level of income, and so on. I think the big question that the Chinese people and the Chinese leaders must raise is, to what extent you can have all that economic success and keep your politics basically static. You have to think, what is the consistency between one track and the other track. You don't want, let's say, in Marxist terms, to provoke contradictions, historical contradictions. I think, and I hope the Chinese leaders have the wisdom to see that and to keep working so that this rise of China continues to be peaceful and satisfactory for the Chinese population.
Mm-hmm. Well, after fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, for almost 2 years, we now have this new variant Omicron that is far more infectious and is now sweeping many parts of the world. So I wonder, how is the situation mostly, say, Mexico, US, North America, and how do you say it has affected globalization and the global supply chain, where, of course, China, Mexico, US, probably they all play very important roles?
Well, of course, the pandemic was also and continues to be not only a terrible human tragedy, but it has been an economic tragedy. Some estimates believe that, let's use economic terms, the net present value of the economic cost of the pandemic probably was close to 25 trillion US trillion dollars. This is just one of the many estimates. But of course, if it has been that costly economically, it also means that it has disrupted international trade. It has disrupted, as you mentioned, supply chain. Now, I think this effect is temporary, because to the extent that countries are successful to fight the pandemic and eventually reduce it to an endemic disease, which probably will be around for a long time or forever, I think we will be, in principle, back to conditions that will not imply this disruption in supply chains. However, lessons must be extracted, right? And that has to be the right lessons, not the wrong lessons. Because some people say, oh, you see what happened in the pandemic with international trade and supply chain shows that we should be more close. We should resource to our own countries, everything, because we don't want to depend on international trade, because what if we have another pandemic? Well, I think that's a very silly statement. First of all, we want to prevent the next pandemic from happening. And we know how to at least mitigate the very negative consequences that this time around we have had, but we have to do the right thing to prevent such a negative, dramatically costly pandemic. And second, in terms of economics, what you want is to diversify. You don't want to depend only on one supply chain. You want to have diversification of your supply chain. And this is very interesting because when you say diversify my supply chain, that calls for more, not less globalization. So my conclusion is totally opposite to what these people that are grabbing the pandemic say, oh, we should become autarkic, we should not depend on international trade. I think that's totally wrong, because if you want to be autarkic, probably means that you want to be poorer.
Well, this, the year 2022 marks its 50th anniversary of political and diplomatic relations between China and Mexico. I mean, how would you review the past 5 decades of China-Mexico ties? And how would you say this relationship is doing now, especially in the current global political climate?
Well, I think Mexico and China have had very friendly and respectful relations over this half a century. However, I think that the relationship between Mexico and China has a much bigger potential than the one we have taken advantage, the two countries, up to now. So I think probably an objective for the next 50 years should be a closer and more beneficial relationship for the two countries. I think over the last years, there was this relationship, economic competition, thinking, oh, China and Mexico are competing in the same markets, the US. Well, I think Mexico and China are engaged in the global economy, part of it being a very important part, the United States market. But I would say the global economy is very big, and if everybody helps to make it grow, it will be in the benefit of every country. And I think Mexico is a very attractive market for China, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of investment. And of course, China is a very attractive market for Mexico. So I think there are tremendous opportunities that could bring benefit for the two countries. So we should be more focused in the next 50 years to take advantage of those opportunities. But of course, it's not only economics. I think we also have to be more coordinated as emerging countries. You know, China is a great emerging country, Mexico is a great emerging country, and our voices in the geopolitics of the world should be heard aloud.
Thank you, Dr. Ernesto Zedillo, for your time and insights. With that, we come to the end of today's show. You can also find us on CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.